afternoon, actually. How are you? So what do you think about the framing today? Yes, we are in Paris. Yes, we can see at least two landmarks, monuments, belonging to two very different moments in history, eras. But the good thing is that those moments are very well known across the world. So we're talking about ancient Egypt, because the monument that is closest to us is the obelisk of Luxor Temple, one of the two obelisks of the Luxor Temple in Egypt. And the one that is farthest, I don't have to explain to you, is the Tour Eiffel. And if you prefer, I think we are going to stay with the one that is closest to us today. We'll talk about the Tour Eiffel in another moment if you want. The Luxor, one of the two obelisks of the Luxor Temple, Ramses II temple in ancient Egypt. It's a phenomenal landmark that kind of like is going to help us. It's going to be our portal to go to those times if you want to follow me. And let's go to the ancient Mediterranean, and let's connect this world of the ancient Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, with the Fertile Crescent and Central Asia, this whole ancient Eurasia, interconnected through phenomena such as the Silk Road, right? This ancient commerce, not only of goods but also of ideas. So it was just raining a second ago. I hoped, because before I just did I actually did this video in Spanish, and it was raining a little bit, and I was hoping that the rain was going to keep going, because we are at the expanse of the elements. And today I just didn't want to talk about climate or big trends a long time, but about the weather. What's happening right now? Is it raining? Sun is popping up. You have this sort of cloudy spring sort of day. Well, the topic today is bioclimatism, or how we create systems to be able to not only survive but thrive. And hopefully we are talking about systems that don't require a lot of resources and energy, right? Can the ancient world, or techniques or technologies of the ancient, or ideas of the ancient world related to bioclimatism, to how to be all right in a place, can those systems help us to envision systems that can be better for the future, can create a lot of value without a lot of resources meaning not only money but especially energy translated into impact? So going back to Egypt, ancient Egypt, let's leave aside, because maybe in the future we'll talk about Ramses the second and the pharaonic Egypt, and we are going to get closer to present time, and we'll go to the Ptolemaic Egypt, to this Hellenistic Egypt with a culture that was that merged, or was syncretic, right? Merged the cultures of the ancient Greeks with the Egyptians, and also the influx of the civilization of the Fertile Crescent, what we call Babylonia, right? If we go to this world that is basically Hellenistic, and go even further and get to the first century of our era, after Christ, we have the Thomas Edison of the Roman Empire, Heron of Alexandria. Alexandria was a very cosmopolitan city in Egypt. Basically Hellenistic culture, but as we were talking, there was an influx of ideas coming from Babylonia, from of course the Aegean Sea, the Greek world, also the Levantine cultures, ancient cultures, and also further in Africa. And so all these worlds influenced Heron of Alexandria, who was also living in Roman times. So let's think about Rome as the real power of civil engineering, of big thinking related to communications, but also to infrastructure. Now it's an important topic because we have to create infrastructure, but also to maintain it. And things such as climate are becoming more complicated. So Heron of Alexandria, the Thomas Edison of the first century of our era, he did actually test a lot of things. He was a maker of his time. He would, it's attributed to him the first steam engine, for example, but also pneumatic systems for, let's say, even moving big things such as big pieces of big monuments. Let's remember that in ancient times, the monuments that still exist were created with basically animal force, human force, animal power and human power, but also ingenuity. We are talking about systems of pulleys and ropes and pneumatic forces, for example, like the ones Heron of Alexandria envisioned. We are interested in another thing Heron of Alexandria was working on in the first century after Christ. He was one of the, let's say, scholars very interested in wind power applied to utility. He actually, since he knew from different cultures, he probably was aware of techniques such as the one he explained. There were actually vertical axis windmills. As we know, the European windmills we always imagine are the Don Quixote ones. Let's say it's a tower with a horizontal axis, and then you have the blades that will move against the wind. Vertical axis windmills are actually predate those, the ones we know, and they're actually, we could argue that they are quite efficient because let's imagine them. Their axis is vertical. Their design is similar to a cylinder that will move depending on the wind, but the wind can come from different areas. The let's say European or the ones created in the Western Mediterranean, the ones we know, windmills that are still used for creating electricity power these days, depend on where the wind is coming from, and sometimes they cannot work. They are quite intermittent even when there is wind, if the wind doesn't come the way it should come from. And this windmill doesn't have the ability to move to accommodate to these different winds. This wind will be lost or won't be used. On the other hand, vertical axis windmills called panemones, as Heron of Alexandria explained, they can be used, or they are put to use with a little breeze. You don't need a lot of wind, and wind can come from different places. So they are quite useful, and their potential is especially interesting if you want to create systems that are reliable over time, not intermittent. if you don't have systems of, let's say, storage, if you cannot transform the wind power into electricity and then store that electricity, that can be done, actually, especially in our times, not in the times of Heron. But let's say you want to use, like the ancients, the mechanical force of these windmills. Well, vertical axis ones, we have to actually imagine how they were, because they were actually used from ancient times all the way to almost our times, and there are still panemones that are used in Iran, in modern Iran. Let's remember, Persia was this important civilization in between the Mediterranean world and the Far East world, and the Silk Roads, which is cross also ancient Persia. Nashtifan is one of the towns that still have panemones working. Nashtifan, east of Iran, very close to Afghanistan. There is this ancient town. Let's remember the style of towns of these desertic, very rough weather, very extreme weather, desertic, very hot areas of Iran. Their buildings are basically clay, and so there is little else that, let's say, dirt, sand, and water, and bricks. Let's remember they are cooked, but there is basically the same raw material. Those ancient times, Nashtifan still has them, would have sometimes these walls with vertical axis windmills on them that would capture wind no matter where wind was coming from, and they would use that wind to mill grain, for example, to create flour for bread, for example. But also they were used for let's say, pumping water. And here we're coming to bioclimatism, to how to accommodate the population in places that were really challenging because they were hot. So you would need to protect cities from invaders as well as from extreme weather. Invaders, extreme weather. So those challenges. Let's imagine those, let's say, integrated systems to create a climatic reality inside of those cities that was very different from the outside. Well, we have, for example, wind power to mill grain, but also to pump water. There are also cisterns to accumulate water, so water doesn't evaporate with basically the climate of the desert. We have subterranean canals across the city that would connect the wells. That water, because of gravity and because of pumps, for example, mechanical pumps connected to wind power, to the Panamones hands, which just transport all this water across the city. And we have another element we have to think about that is more vertical, like the Luxor obelisk. Those are wind catchers. Wind catchers were basically buildings with a long tower with orifices on top. Wind would come from one of our orifices down inside of the building. Let's remember there is water on subterranean canals going through. So that wind, especially the wind that is, let's say, cooler, has more weight, so it will come down. Hotter air would go out, would leave through the wind catcher, and then there is an interchange that in play with, let's say, narrow streets with shades, also with plants, and with another element, which is evaporation, just made a microclimate that wasn't only livable, but very, very pleasant, and was able to not only host people, but create also to self-provide food, because there were also gardens that were not only ornamental, the ones in Babylonia, but also the ones we imagine, of course, but also eatable, right? So there is a system. So you have vertical axis windmills, panemones, that you can still see in Nashtifan, Iran. You have water that goes through from cisterns through canals all over the city that are subterranean. You have wind cutters on buildings that are vertical. So cold wind gets even cooler with subterranean weather, and then the hotter one evaporates. And then you have evaporation also, because water and evaporation, that system, which is very ancient, in the Mediterranean is very known, because we actually use still, some people use the old school amphorae, the old school recipients, containers, water containers, that are made of clay or terracotta, and they keep the water really cool, and that is done through evaporation. It's because the material is porous. The porosity allows from the interchange of different thermal realities, the one inside of the container of the water and the one outside. So in Spain we call it un botijo. So it's the same system, evaporation. Okay, so let's think about the Alhambra in Granada in Spain. The gardens inside, they play with water, they play with plants, with shades, and with wind. And you create a microclimate that is very pleasant. And there are only ornamental plants. We can imagine having an eatable garden in such a situation. It will work, I assure you. How about, let's go to other places that could teach us something. Let's go to the Hellenistic world again. Let's remember Heron of Alexandria. He belonged to this Hellenistic culture, despite the fact that he was Greek from Alexandria. He was also living in Egypt, in the Roman province of Egypt. If we go to the 6th century before Christ, let's remember the Greeks were doing across the Mediterranean what Phoenicians had been doing, which they were doing westward and selling in colonies to do commerce and get some raw materials. There was one colony they founded in the 6th century before Christ in current Spain, in current Catalonia, Girona province, called Emporius. Emporion, in this colony, the Greeks, they had different issues, but two of them were quite important. Tribes surrounding them, they were nasty at them. They were Iberians, they were, to some accounts, they were tough people. And the other was the lack of reliable source of water to drink and survive, because there was only one creek and Mediterranean style of creeks. So some times of the year, depending on how dry it was, they wouldn't have such a reliable source. So they needed to get the water from the rain and store it. So they did it. They created these clay containers and to accumulate the water, but the water accumulated cannot be potable, or sometimes it's not potable, or you can make sure it can be, it won't just make you sick. What in Emporion, what they did was to create a filter with sands and volcanic rock inside of each of the containers to make sure that water was fine for human and animal consumption. They did it, and it works. That's 6th century before Christ. So we are talking about water catching, a system that is not only reliable but beautiful if you think about it. It's really sustainable. You can fix it. If it breaks, you just make another clay container. And we've talked about bioclimatism in Central Asian cities, ancient cities like Nashtifan. And we talk about how interior patios with gardens and fountains of running water are not only ornamental, but those are actually the crystallization, like the one in the Alhambra of Granada. They are the crystallization of an old tradition of bioclimatism we've forgotten about because we think we have everything figured out before them, better than them. Are we really sure about that? So let's think about what we were talking today. Those systems, this water catching, this system of bioclimatism, those vertical axis windmills, the panemones. And let's think about ways those could inspire better designs for the future. I just wouldn't mind to help somebody, maybe it's going to be us in the end, to create systems, to create cities, or let's start with neighborhoods or with the little towns that could just integrate such systems. Wouldn't it be beautiful? Anyway, as I was saying in the beginning, it's raining again. So this is spring in Paris. Let's keep talking about these topics. We'll see what the comments you guys have to say in the comments. And thanks, Alex Props, for helping with the graphics. And see you next week.